Okay, so here we go. This is class 11 of in this book called Defiance and Devotion, book from the previous Rebbe. We're in the first mimer. There's a few mimarim in that book, and we're in the first mimer called Vekibeil HaYehudim. And in that mimer, we are in section 11. So if you have the book, the actual physical book, we're on page 37. And if you are following in the link, that I sent out in the email, we're in section 11. Okay. So what we've been talking about, right? The big picture of this mimer is that the bigger question was, how did the Jews, it says Vekibeil HaYehudim, that's the mimer that we're in, Vekibeil HaYehudim, which means the Jews accepted what they already began, meaning they accepted at the time of Purim what they had already begun at the time of the giving of the Torah. And the bigger question is, that means at some level they were at a higher level at the time of Purim than they were at the time of the giving of the Torah. So the mimer is explaining, and that was that's difficult to understand at first glance, because of the giving of the Torah, they saw all these revelations of Hashem, and they just got out of Egypt, and now they were going to, receiving the Torah. So it's hard to understand how it could be that at the time of Purim, when it was a time of exile and so on, how could they have reached a higher level? So that's like the big picture question. But we started talking about the way that the soul fills the body, and the three sections of the body, the head, the torso, and the legs, and how there's different levels of godliness and what they sort of each do. And then it talks about how God fills the world, and there's the three worlds of past the point of creation, something from nothing, which are Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, and they start, they sort of reflect the way that Hashem fills the world, sort of reflects the way that the soul fills the body. And we talked about two levels of Hashem's godliness, right? We had the idea of the godliness that fills, but then there's also the godliness that transcends and encompasses. So we've been talking about that, and the last class we've been talking about how, well, I guess maybe 2 classes ago, we're talking about how faith, the Jewish people's faith, there's different levels of faith and different ways that we relate to and connect with the faith, and it's been talking about the upper level, das Elyon and das Tachton, the higher perspective and the lower perspective of the world, and Hashem's perspective, or the highest level of godliness perspective, and the human perspective, and the concepts of how Hashem relates to the world and how we relate to Hashem, right? So we talked about the two psukim of Shema and Baruch Shem as representing sort of the way that we have faith in Hashem, in the way that Hashem fills the world, and we can sort of relate at some level to it, and it brings about a nullification of ourselves, of our yeshus, of our selfness. And then the higher level of relating to Hashem is like from the pasuk of Shema, and that's the level of the transcendent level of light of Hashem, and that brings about a nullification of our very existence, because everything is only God at that level. So we've a little bit been talking about those ideas of faith and the 2 levels of faith. We mentioned how ultimately the ultimate level of faith is really something that's beyond intellect. And the example is that thief, right? The thief who prays to God that he should be successful in his thievery, and he's praying to God, and God, so obviously believes in God, and yet he's praying to God to help him do something that's against God's will. And that seemed, but we don't say he doesn't really believe in God. He does really believe in God, right? We're not saying it's a false belief. It's a true belief. Otherwise, why would he be praying? and yet at the same time, he's doing something that is against God's will. So it seems kind of paradoxical why he would be reaching out to God. So it's an inconsistency, but it's possible because faith is removed from the intellectual understanding, right? It's not just an intellectual understanding. It's something that is higher than that, and therefore it's not always enclosed in intellectual understanding, and therefore there can be a logical inconsistency in faith. Okay, so that's a little bit like what we've been doing until now, and now we're in section 11. You have a question, Talia?
I know I've missed classes, which I apologize for with being in Boston and stuff, but last week at the very end, it was like really intense information, complex, and I felt like we were, well, I'll speak for myself. I was getting it, but it's almost like the end of last week's class. I could use the recording. Do you have a recording of it?
Yeah, I could send you a recording. Yeah,
because I just feel like I need that again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna reread the synopsis of last week as a way of jumpstarting into this week. But this class starts with an example from the previous of how we can relate this idea to our lives, ourselves, not just the thief, but ourselves. How we could be this level. We could have this inconsistency as well. It's a little bit of a harsh example. I'm just warning people. The previous of can be sometimes very black and white in the way he describes things. But he does give an example that maybe will make it a little easier. I'm not sure. And then he's going to go into, well, I don't know how far we'll get, but the next section goes into like specific meditations to have in the two first verses, Shema, Baruch Shem, and how like we take this very esoteric idea that we were talking about last week and we translate it into a meditation when we're davening. Then these next two sections do that. So I think those things will also help like ground the ideas a little bit more. But they are definitely complex ideas. Like the rest of the mimer is really going to be unpacking them more and more as we go on. But okay, I can read maybe the last paragraph in the synopsis from last week. I think maybe that will help everybody too. So it says, this inconsistency is possible because from the thief, right? Because faith is far removed from our ordinary conscious processes and is not internalized within them. Faith doesn't make sense. By definition, faith doesn't make sense. When you have faith in something, it's because you don't completely understand it. If you completely understood it, you wouldn't require faith. You just understand it. And that's the end of it, right? If the faith radiating in a man were to be integrated within him, he would find it impossible to defy God's will, to transgress the directives that come from his mouth, right? If we knew it so clearly, if it wasn't just a faith thing that we could like explain this way, explain that way, but if we completely knew it, we wouldn't be able to transgress God's will, just like the thief is able to, because it's a transcendent faith. It doesn't integrate into his consciousness and his intellect and then his actions. It doesn't translate in that way. This paradoxical situation can exist only because faith stands beyond our ordinary conscious processes. It's something that's a little bit removed from our ordinary conscious processes. It's something that we like rely on without even necessarily knowing or realizing or understanding how. And it does affect us, but it doesn't affect us the same way something that we understand affects us. If we really understood something, So this is the synopsis. Our faith in God as Mimali Kol Almin, that's the level of Hashem that fills all the world, and Soiviv Kol Almin, that's the level of Hashem transcends the world, brings about two types of bittul, two types of nullification. A, the bittul associated with the lower plane of knowledge, Bittul Hayesh, which means the created beings negate themselves to the ayin, the ray of godliness, which brings the world into existence. That means, right, this lower level means there is a level we understand. And that is a level of faith, and it's a level of faith that is internalized. There's that level, there's that piece, right? We believe God made the world and he runs the world, and therefore he has, so to speak, the right to tell us what to do and how to do it, and it makes sense to do that. And he's, like all those parables of, let's say, the manufacturer who manufactured something, and he gives you the instruction booklet, like my husband always says as a joke, when all else fails, read the instructions. Like you're trying to get something from Amazon, you're trying to put it together, and it's like, it's not working. It's like, well, look at this, it comes with an instruction booklet. Why don't we look at the instruction booklet and see, maybe that actually will tell us how this thing runs, So there's that level of belief in Hashem, like, oh, we do believe Hashem, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusa Le'Aved. His kingship is in the world. He created the world. His kingship is in the world. If anybody knows sort of how the world runs properly, like, let's read the instruction booklet, and it makes a lot of sense to follow the instruction booklet. If we don't want this machine to break, we want it to keep running, and we want it to keep, functioning, and it says have a tune-up every year, so we're going to have a tune-up every year, like we're just going to sort of do what we need to do to keep it running properly. So that is called Bitul Hayesh, in a sense. Like, it's like, well, I want to, plug this in, and I do want to immerse the mechanism in water to wash it. Well, go right ahead, but you're going to break it, but I want to do it. Okay, go ahead. Like, nobody's going to stop you, but then it's going to break. You're going to have to get a new one. So that's Bitul Hayesh. Like, I want to wash it in the water, but I see in the instruction book that it says it's going to ruin it. I want it to work more than I want to wash it in water. So I'm going to be, mivatel my yeshus. I'm gonna nullify my selfhood, this is what I want to do, right? And I'm not going to immerse it in water, because that's, it's going to ruin it. I'm going to just keep it, sponge cleaner, I don't know, whatever the instructions are for this lamp, right? Like, I'm not, whatever it is. So I have actually nullified my selfhood, my yesh, right? To the instructions that were given by the manufacturer. That's sort of one level, but then the higher level is bittul associated with the higher plane of knowledge, bittul the mitzvos. That means, I'm nothing in front of the self of the creator. That we don't have that for manufacturer of some kind of lamp. We don't have that. Our acceptance of these two, when we try to have that for Hashem, it's not always so easy. Our acceptance of these two levels of bittul is expressed in our statements: God is one, and blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. These are two levels of bittul. Faith, however, by its very definition, transcends our ordinary conscious processes. Therefore, it can lead to the paradox whereby a thief calls on God before breaking in. Meaning, both of these levels require faith of some kind. He doesn't review that here, but both of these levels require faith of some kind. However, the ultimate level of faith, the highest level of faith, is not necessarily, it's not automatically connected to our conscious processes. It comes from a higher level in the soul than the conscious processes. This is one of the challenges that people have, especially in this generation. The man's intellect is not the highest level, not in creation and not of our selfhood. We're not, in the Western world, we're trained that it is. So it's hard to accept that it's not, right? Like, that's one of the ideas of Yamuka. There's something on top of a person's brain. And it's a constant reminder that there's something on top of a person's brain. So this idea that if we understand something, then its truth is not a Torah concept necessarily, right? It's not anti-Torah, meaning, yes, there's a part of it that we are supposed to understand something. We are supposed to work at understanding. It's a mitzvah to understand Torah and to know God. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah to know God. Well, how are we supposed to know God unless we work at understanding him, right? We do want that, work at that, try hard for that. This is all about teaching us about God, right? Like, and at the same time, we take on faith that there's more that we don't understand, right? Faith begins where understanding ends. So that, and it's housed in a place in the soul that's above understanding. So of course it's beyond understanding because its source is above understanding. Understanding is the first of the 10 soul powers that are internalized. Faith resides in Kesser, which is above our internalized soul powers. There's things we don't understand. Basically, what that means in plain English is there's things we don't understand that are still true, even if we don't understand them. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm taking that silence as confusion or
can I
as,
just say, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
The way I'm interpreting this or understanding what you're saying is because our level of understanding cannot tell what's truth really at all. Because if, you know what I mean? Like you said, like truth, is elusive because our level of understanding anything, there's always something above our understanding. So we could never be sure what's truth. Now we know Torah is truth, but we can never be sure about the understanding of it because we can't, because of our level of our level of brain power, which is not high enough to, you know what I'm saying?
Right, so that's another idea. I think what you're saying is that, well, let me backtrack for a minute. Truth is what God says is true, not what we say is true. So we can be sure, like you said, we can be sure something is true if God tells us it's true. One of the 13 principles of faith is that God communicates with man. So we don't have to feel like we're being left in the dark as to what truth is just because we don't understand everything, because God communicates to us what truth is in the Torah. Now, could we understand perfectly what Torah is telling us? It's a work of a lifetime. And if Ruth was here on this class, she would say, and that's why you need a mashpia, and that's also why you need a rav, and right, like we need to ask questions to Rabbanim. We need to ask questions to people who know more than us. That's what the whole idea of a Rebbe. Oh, well, that's really what the Mimer is going to talk about, is basically the role of a Rebbe in helping us to connect with our faith. Meaning we don't have to be scared. Like it's not a scary thing. That it sounds like it's a scary thing the way that I'm understanding what you're saying. It's not that it's a scary thing. It's that we know that Hashem, that's why we also, one of the fundamentals of faith is that Hashem communicates with him. He's not trying to hide the truth from us. It's not like some sort of a guessing game or something like that. He tells us, here are 613 paths to me. This is how you get to touch, connect with God's essence right here in these 613 pathways. And the only point that I was trying to make was that faith doesn't reside in the brain naturally. It's above the brain naturally. And one of our goals is to take faith and help it enter the brain, because once it enters the brain, we can manipulate it. We can use it to live our life. Manipulate it in a good way, meaning actually sort of grasp it. We can take the faith and grasp it and use it to apply practical decisions in our life once we've integrated it into our selfhood. So then, instead of being the thief that asks God to help us break into the house, we're asking God to help us do his will, and we're working on doing that instead, kind of a thing.
Chaya, the I think if you can define the difference again, but I know you spent all this time defining it. Bitul hayesh and bitul b'metzias. Bitul metzias, because it sounds almost the same, and I think that's where the confusion is coming in. It sounds almost the same that you have to give up your intellect more or less, and read the instruction book and follow the instruction book rather than your own inclination. And bitul metzias, wasn't as clearly defined. Between that and reading the instruction book.
Well, bitul b'metzias is something where it's just your whole existence is nullified in the face of Hashem. There's no other existence besides Hashem. That's the pasuk of Shema.
Okay.
We don't really exist at that level all the time. We can't exist in the physical world, but we have to connect to that at some level so that it informs how we live in the physical world. That's more like, that's the idea of Mesiras Nefesh. That's when a person says what's the use of living in the physical world if they're telling me that I need to, like the stories of Hanukkah and under Stalin era and whatever it is, I'm not going to eat treif I'm not going to even eat kosher food in front that looks like treif that they're going to tell the Jews is treif, right? That's the story of Hanukkah, right? They're going to give him kosher food, but they're going to tell the Jews that it's not kosher. And he doesn't have to eat non-kosher food. It's just going to look like he's eating non-kosher food, and he won't, and he wouldn't do that either, because what's the point of life if it's not about service of Hashem? True life is service of Hashem. So I have no independent life of Hashem. That leads a person to the ability to have Mesiras Nefesh, right?
And
that's a completely different level than agreeing that whatever God says goes in life. This is like, and if somebody is trying to separate me from God in life, then that life is not a life, which is why there's certain times when a person, we say generally Vekibeil HaYehudim, we're supposed to live with the Torah, mitzvos, and everything else. And then there's those few instances where a person is required to give up their life, because it's not called a life if that life is severing the person from God at any level. That's an extreme level, right? So like that person's not even eating kosher food that looks like treif because it's going to make a chil Hashem, and making a desecration of God's name is the reason to give up one's life, because what is life that's going to be a desecration of God's name? Whereas if a person, God forbid, was ill and they needed to eat something that wasn't kosher in order to heal themselves, they'd be permitted to, and any Rav would say not only would they be permitted to, they must, they're required to. That's not a desecration of God's name. That's eating treif in order to live a life and keep a body and soul together so that they can serve Hashem is a reason to eat treif. But eating kosher in a manner that's going to be telling the Jews that it's okay to eat treif in a time when a foreign nation is trying to destroy the Jewish nation is not okay. Even though the sage himself is going to be eating kosher, right? One is a desecration of God's name and one is not a desecration of God's name. That's why Mesiras Nefesh comes from that higher level of the soul.
And that's bitul b'metzias.
I mean, at some level it is, but
on a level, right?
Right. I mean, that's the best example I can think of now to explain the difference.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
One is about submitting one's will within the structure of something. One is about giving oneself up completely, because what is one's existence except God?
Yeah, that's the best definition. The bitul hayesh is you have the instruction book, and bitul b'metzias, there's no instruction book. You just are. You just
aren't.
Yeah. Or just aren't, right? Right. Okay, thank you. That's best. Thank you.
I think that's how I would explain it. I mean,
thank you.
So I have a question, Chaya. So we've established that the thief can be a person of faith, but can at the same time, can he be said to have betachon? And if so, how would you characterize his faith if at the same time he has betachon? How does that affect his faith?
Well, you're asking for the difference between bitachon and emunah. I'm not really sure that this mimer is addressing it, and I'm not really sure that this mimer is addressing that difference. Meaning, bitachon usually is defined as it's sort of like trusting God in like the immediate, like practical sense almost.
Yeah.
So I don't know that this example makes a differentiation, meaning he is trusting God in the practical, like he's going to go in and he believes God is gonna, he believes there's a God. That's like maybe his general faith, and his bitachon is that God's going to make him successful in this endeavor, this business endeavor of his. His business endeavor is going against God's will. That's the issue. But I don't know that there's any distinction here between faith and trust. He's having both, as far as I understand. And I don't think the mimer is making a distinction here. The mimer is not really talking about the difference between faith and trust. It's talking about faith and where it resides in the soul. Maybe, by corollary, including trust in that too. But even in this definition of trust being something in the practical, I would say he also has trust. He's trusting God's going to make him successful here. He's going into this business endeavor because he trusts that God's going to make him successful. The same way that a businessman would go into an honest business endeavor, trusting God's going to make him successful. The issue is that what he's choosing to do is going against God's will, but what we don't say is that it's a lack of faith. That's the point that the mimer is bringing out here. It's not a lack of faith what he's doing. It is a lack of integrating that faith into his understanding, but it's not a lack of faith. There's a disconnect happening. That's the issue. And that's really what the mimer is going to address later on, is that what we need to do is connect the two. Otherwise, we wind up with this type of situation where the thief is asking God for success in an endeavor that goes against his will.
Yeah, but bitachon is not the belief that that you're going to basically get what you want or what you would like. It's faith that whatever happens, that it's in God's hands and it is for the best, even if it doesn't feel that way.
That's faith. Bitachon is that you're going to get what you want in the way that you want it with revealed good. Faith is, and if it doesn't happen that way, then it's also ultimately good, and we believe in it. We believe in God.
Okay.
I mean, that's how I understand it.
Okay, thanks.
Meaning the whole point of bitachon is like, I'm going into this business venture because I think it's going to work, because God's going to bless it and it's going to be revealed good in the way that I can see that it's good. Then when that doesn't happen, God forbid, that's when faith kicks in and we say, okay, this too is for the good. I just don't see it right now. That's why it's faith. Faith is something I don't understand.
Okay, maybe I just had the two reversed. I thought faith was simply, belief that there is a God, and bitachon is the belief that he is in control, and he's in control, and whatever happens is his will, and it's good. I think I had them mixed up, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that could be an interesting class to spend time, whatever. That was another idea for this class, was actually to do Shar Bitachon, but we didn't do it. We did this instead. But I'm saying I think from what I understand, and I haven't looked this up in depth, and I have reviewed it recently. But what I understand is that Bitachon, as the Rebbe explains it, is this idea that I do believe I have trust. It's different than
Trust,
belief. I have
trust.
that God is going to make this work out for the revealed good.
Yeah.
When that doesn't happen, that's when I access my faith and I say, okay, I have faith that even though this is not revealed good, it is for the ultimate good of me and the world, both personally and globally. That's faith. Trust is, we trust in God, so to speak. I mean, hate to get patriotic here for a minute, but we trust in God every day when we get into our cars and we cross the street, and like we just trust that God is going to get us to where we have to go safely and everything else. And and even when things get a little pushy, like maybe we're, I don't know, something's wrong with the car and we're trusting that God's going to get us to the mechanic, whatever it is, it doesn't have to just be everything smooth sailing. We trust, and then God forbid when something's not obviously good, then that's when our faith kicks in and we're like, okay, even so, God knows what he's doing, even though I don't know what God's doing. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah, I think part of the confusion is just semantics between the two words. Yeah,
Okay.
maybe.
Okay.
But thank you.
Okay. Okay. So, are we ready to go on? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay. Okay, so let's start section 11. Okay, so I just want to warn you, there's a little bit of the previous I was going to give an example here, but the example is going to be a little bit strong. So prepare yourselves for a little bit strong wording from the previous Rebbe. Okay, every single person can find parallels to such a paradox, meaning this paradox of the thief who was standing in front of this house praying to God that he be successful in his business endeavor, not get caught, make a big cash in, whatever. And we say, obviously that's a paradox because he's asking God for help to go against his own will. So every single person can find parallels to such a paradox, whether as grossly as the thief, or perhaps more subtly with his own personal situation. We ask for help from God, blessed be he, and yet the things we ask for may be utterly superfluous, serving merely to fulfill our desires. This is surely not his will, unless such a person's situation parallels that of the thief who prays before breaking in, as mentioned above. What causes such a situation? A fundamental error which many people make regarding themselves. They are so convinced of their importance and personal worth that they think they deserve wealth and other blessings, and thus they rationalize that they will be able to serve God through Torah study and prayer amidst prosperity. This, however, is only a rationalization. In truth, their ultimate motivation is the wish that these material benefits fulfill their own desires, a motivation that does not reflect God's will at all. So that's like a very strong example. There are other more subtle expressions of the above paradox. Commercial activity, for example, is intended to be a medium through which one can earn a livelihood. This medium must be pure, meaning it should not involve the slightest trace of prohibitions of falsehood, dishonesty, and the like. In fact, one's business dealings should be carried out in good faith, to the extent that one speaks the truth in one's heart, as our sages teach. That's like level 1 of how a person should do business. Level 2. Moreover, the overriding consideration should be that one's business dealings be carried out for the sake of heaven. In other words, it should be totally honest, and also there should be a godly intention, meaning one should be motivated by a divine intent. It is true that permission has been granted to engage in business and to work, as it is written, 6 days shall you work. And it is written, and God will bless you in all that you do, implying that his blessing requires a certain measure of human activity, which it will prosper and enhance. I mean, we have to make a vessel in this physical world, right? And that's why we're commanded to work and we're supposed to work. Nevertheless, that activity itself is not the divine intent underlying creation. Not for this was man created. On the contrary, the purpose of man's creation is implied by the verse, I made the world and I created man upon it. The word meaning I created, barasti, is numerically equivalent to taryag, an acronym that alludes to the 613 mitzvos. For these are the reason for the world's creation. One's commercial activity should therefore be motivated by a spiritual purpose. For example, the refinement of the material substance of the world, which is achieved through this activity. Accordingly, when one asks God for help in earning a livelihood, one must first be certain that his business constitutes a pure medium. That's the first thing, right? Should be halachically proper. Furthermore, one should ensure that this business is a vessel fit to receive blessings, meaning that it is conducted according to God's intent. That's that second level. So he's comparing, right, the thief's business dealings, right, like this is his business, to a regular person's business dealings, which of course is much more refined example of this idea, right? The previous Rebbe was sort of making a comparison. The thief's business dealings, asking God for help, is obvious that it's going against God's will. He's actually stealing, which is a prohibition. A regular person's business dealings is actually a command to work for 6 days and to rest on the seventh. So there's nothing wrong as long as it's an honest business, right? It's done halachically properly, and the overriding consideration should be that to be carried out for the sake of heaven. That's when we can ask God for help in our business, so to speak, right? So that's anytime that we don't do it that way, it's a much more subtle paradox, but it's the same type of paradox as this thief. It's just a much more subtle version of it, right? So nevertheless, then we ask God, right? These are the two things we have to keep in mind. Nevertheless, since faith transcends the level of our conscious processes, a person often does not pay attention to the above concept in his day-to-day functioning. We're not necessarily aware of that. Thus, we can understand, this is like the main point I feel like he's trying to get to here. Thus, we can understand what it means to nourish faith, right? We were talking about nourishing faith, that in the very beginning of the mimer, it talks about Moshe nourishing the Jewish people's faith, and Mordechai, in the time of Purim, nourished the people's faith. That's how. So that's what it means by nourishing faith, to cause it to radiate within ourselves. That's what we're trying to do. That's the shepherd, remember, the faithful shepherd who is the shepherd of faith. That's from the very beginning of the mimer. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to cause it to radiate within ourselves, i.e., this means to internalize this potential and bring our faith within our intellectual grasp. We want to bring it from this transcendent level into an intellectual grasp, because that's when it becomes an internal soul power, and it's something that we relate to every day, because we function with our brains, hopefully. That's why we function with our brains. This was the spiritual task of Moshe, the shepherd who nurtured faith, allowing the righteous, i.e. every individual among the Jewish people, because we're all called righteous, to live by his faith, so that it is felt with an inward vitality. Meaning, what the pasuk that a person lives by their faith. It's actually a tzad. The pasuk is actually tzaddik be'emunaso yichya, that a tzaddik with his faith lives. That's it. The Alter Rebbe quotes this pasuk in Tanya, and he translates it differently and makes another point. Here, the previous Rebbe is saying this pasuk tzaddik be'emunaso yichya, the righteous live by his faith. He's using that pasuk to explain the righteous means everybody, not just the actual tzaddik, because amech kulam tzaddikim, your people are all called tzaddikim. So every Jew's a tzaddik. So every Jew, yichya, b'emunaso yichya, will live by his faith. That's like a command almost. Like that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to the point where we live by our faith, and therefore our leaders are going to help us achieve that level by, how do we live? We live by eating and drinking. In a physical world, we have to eat and drink. So in a spiritual world, our leaders, like our parents feed us as we're growing up, right? So in a spiritual sense, our leaders feed us our faith, and that's how we live spiritually. That makes sense? Sort of. The question is how they do that, but we'll get to that. But the point is that that's what they're trying to do, right? So Moshe has the potential to nurture the faith of the Jewish people. How does he do that? Because he draws down the attribute of das, knowledge or understanding, into their souls. Now, remember, we talked about das elyon and das tachton. These are these two levels of understanding from the godly perspective, that there's only God, from the physical world perspective, that God's in charge of the world, right? These two levels are both called das. And Moshe feeds us these perspectives, I guess you could say, right? He brings this attribute of das integrated into our souls, instead of hovering over them or transcending them. Furthermore, his efforts are not directed only to the upper echelons of the people. Rather, as implied by the verse in Devarim, that I shall grant pasture in your fields for your animals, that is a parable, that he also drew down attribute of das for the common people whose souls can be described as brutish, as animals, right? Grant pasture in your fields for your animals. I'm also feeding your animals. Moshe's feeding our animals. Also means he's also feeding, so to speak, that it's not just by the righteous who are living by their faith, that he's feeding the righteous and the people who are obviously open to this, or whatever you want to say, feeding them faith. He's also feeding the animals. So he's also feeding the souls of the Jewish people that are at the level of animals, which we learned about in a different mimer of the previous Rebbe in the Beaker Chicago. What is das? Das is a live feeling, right? Remember, das is the third of the three of the intellectual attributes, and that's the lower level of das. And das is the level before the intellect begins. That's the higher level of das. It's maybe called Kesser also in certain circumstances, right? So das connects what's above intellect into intellect, and it also connects the intellect to the emotions. These two levels of das, they form a bridge between that which is above intellect into the intellect, and they form a bridge between the intellect into the emotions. So das is a live feeling. Moshe, the shepherd of faith, nourishes the faith of the souls of the Jewish people, causing it to be experienced with an inner feeling. It causes the faith, which is usually a transcendent entity, I guess you could say, to enter into the intellect and to enter into the emotions. And then it's something that affects us because we can think about it and learn about it, and we can feel it. Let me just read the synopsis. Everyone can find examples of the above mentioned paradox in his own conduct when he asks God for something that contradicts his will. Again, it could contradict his will in a very subtle way, right? Previous service giving examples of a much more subtle way of contradicting God's will than actually breaking into somebody's house and stealing, right? But on a very, very refined level, we may also ask God for something that contradicts his will. People often err in their self-appraisal, considering that they are worthy of children, wealth, and esteem, and forgetting that they have not even if they have not committed gross sins, there are many subtler faults that ought to be considered, such as the manner and the mediums through which one earns a livelihood. Such anomalies may be averted by internalizing one's faith. Nourishing faith means causing it to radiate and to be thoroughly integrated within oneself. So even though faith in its natural residence is completely above our understanding, the leader of the generation, the Moshe Rabbeinu, and later on in the times of Purim Mordechai, helps us to internalize our faith. We are called, the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu was called the Dardea, the generation of knowledge, right? The Das is about bridging the gap between our souls and our intellect and our emotions. That's like the sort of the function of Das. It's a connector. So when the leader of the generation activates the connector, we get connected. I could say, I don't want to say we become internally connected to our different parts of our soul. I don't know if you remember, we're gonna have to end class in a minute, but I don't know if you remember years ago, Women to Women had Yitzchak Ginsburg talk about developing our das. Do you remember? I don't know if anybody on this call was there during that time or not. It's a really beautiful class called Developing Our Das, where I asked him to talk about this because the most important, in a certain way, one could make the argument, I guess one could make the argument about each of the spheres, but in a certain way, one could make the argument that developing a person's das is the most important thing to do because it's this connector between everything. So a Rebbe helps a person to do that. How does a Rebbe help a person to do that? But really, we would say through teaching Chassidus. Like the Chassidus has the attributes of intellect and emotions and ignites the essence of the soul because it is a revelation of new light coming from the highest levels of Hashem. So it has that effect on a person that it brings their faith within their grasp. Anyway, this requires more time to unpack.
Can I ask a quick question? So one of the things that I know that I've learned that the Rebbe loved the nigunim, and you see that in all the gem videos. And I feel like that's a direct connection to this part of faith talking about in a way that it just reaches the soul in a different way, singing all these nigunim.
Yeah.
I was wondering why women don't have an opportunity in their own circles to kind of work that angle
We
to
do.
reach this level.
We do have an opportunity in our own circles.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at every Farbrengen, the girls in the girls' high school, we sing Nigunim. At the Farbrengens, at my house, at the Defiance Farbrengens or things like that, we usually, I can't say always, but I'd say 80% of the time we sing Nigunim.
Wow.
It's at a Farbrengen, time to sing Nigunim are at a Farbrengen.
So our old folks could even be brought into that.
I'm saying we do sing Nigunim, we just don't, it's not usually at a class that we sing Nigunim, it's at a Farbrengen.
Right.
So it's at a Shabbos
Right.
Farbrengen or then Devianta Farbrengen or something like that.
Okay.
But I would say that if you go on Chabad.org and when you come onto class, if you come onto class early, and I have the flyer up saying class will start shortly, I have a nigun playing.
Yeah.
So you could always log on to class 5 minutes early and listen to a nigun for 5 minutes before class starts. I like the idea of people listening to nigun before they start learning Torah.
Okay.
But besides for that, you can go onto Chabad.org and go onto their inspiration and entertainment tab. And then there's 2 tabs there, chassidic melodies or Chabad melodies or something, and also a nigun is forever. And you can go onto those tabs and you can play on your computer all day long. You can be listening to nigunim all day long and as background music while you're doing whatever you're doing in your house. So
Okay. Thank you.
yeah, for sure. And this getaway, maybe we can teach and sing some nigunim.
I think that would be great.
Yeah. Okay. And anything else? That was a lot to digest. But I think we'll probably wind up talking about this again next class a little bit more, but maybe people want to review this section and then you'll know what questions you have to ask. I know we rushed through it a little bit at the end, but I felt it was important to get to the whole picture of it, and then we could unpack it a little bit more too. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.